They thought he was already finished, not defeated in battle, not overpowered by force, but finished in the quiet administrative way wars often end for individuals. Disarmed, surrounded, categorized. The kind of ending that doesn't make history books because nothing dramatic is supposed to happen next. The American stood in the yard of a Belgian farmhouse, breath fogging in the winter air, boots sinking slightly into packed snow. Around him were men who believed a moment had passed. The fight here was done. The village was almost secured. This part was routine now. German soldiers filled the space in front of him, far more than anyone should have allowed in one place. Some were still lifting rifles from the ground. Others already held them at rest. Their posture said everything. This was no longer combat. This was control. Behind them, 4 Americans knelt in the snow with their hands locked behind their heads. Their weapons lay out of reach. Their faces were rigid, eyes forward, waiting for whatever came next. They had done what soldiers were trained to do when the situation collapsed around them. They had complied. The Germans assumed the same would happen again. An officer stepped forward, younger than expected, jaw tied with irritation. He shoved the muzzle of his submachine gun into the American's stomach. Not hard enough to injure, but hard enough to make a point. He shouted in German, sharp syllables, cutting through the cold. It was an order. It didn't need translation. Drop the weapon. Surrender. End it. This was the moment where resistance usually died quietly, where a man weighed survival against pride and chose breathing over bravery. Every soldier there had seen it before. They were already mentally moving on to the next task. But the American didn't move. He looked at the officer. Then at the kneeling men. Then at the ring of rifles around him. He understood the numbers instantly. He understood the position. He understood what the Germans believed was about to happen. And then he laughed. It wasn't mocking. It wasn't brave. It was sudden and uncontrollable, bursting out of him in short, sharp sounds that didn't belong in a place like this. The laughter echoed off the farmhouse wall, loud enough to turn heads. The officer froze. Confusion flickered across his face before anger replaced it. He shouted again, louder now, face reddening, the gun pressing in tighter. This was not how the script went. Prisoners did not laugh. They begged. They argued. They went silent. They did not laugh. The laughter continued, and with it came something else. Uncertainty. German soldiers shifted their weight. One glanced sideways, another tightened his grip, then loosened it again. A few frowned, trying to understand what they were seeing. The moment stretched, thin and unstable. The officer hesitated. It was a tiny hesitation, the kind that feels invisible while it's happening. A fraction of a second where he tried to decide whether this was defiance, madness, or a trick. That pause broke the rhythm of control he thought he had. The American felt it. He was not thinking about escape routes or odds anymore. His mind had narrowed to something simpler. He had seen what happened to men who surrendered to Azeli. He had heard what followed obedience when mercy ran out. This moment would not end with hands raised. Still laughing, he lifted his arms slowly, palms open, as if conceding at last. The officer watched closely, satisfied that order had been restored. The surrounding soldiers relaxed, just enough to be human again. That was the mistake. The American's hand closed around the grip of his weapon. Movement exploded into the yard. The laughter cut off mid-breath as the submachine gun came up. The first burst of fire was deafening, close enough to feel rather than hear. The officer fell before his body understood what had happened. For an instant, nobody reacted. Then, everything did. The American pivoted, firing into the nearest cluster of soldiers, shouting over the noise. The kneeling men lunged for dropped rifles. Snow kicked up in violent sprays as bullets tore through it. Shouts overlapped, commands dissolving into panic. The Germans had numbers. They had weapons. What they didn't have anymore was control. Some fired wildly, too late and without coordination. Others froze, hands halfway between raising a rifle and dropping it. A few threw their weapons down entirely, instinct taking over as training failed. The yard became chaos in seconds. Smoke hung low. Men stumbled. Orders were shouted and ignored. The American kept moving, never staying still, changing angles, refusing to give the moment back to anyone else. When the firing stopped, it felt abrupt, like a door slamming shut. Bodies lay scattered across the snow. Wounded men groaned. Survivors stood rigid, hands raised, eyes wide with disbelief. The Americans were on their feet again, weapons trained, breathing hard. Less than a minute had passed. The village did not fall that day because of superior planning or overwhelming force. It held because one assumption failed, because one moment did not end the way it was supposed to. Later, people would try to explain it. They would talk about courage, about instinct, about training. They would reduce it to lessons and summaries. But in that yard, none of that mattered. What mattered was that everyone there believed the outcome was settled. They believed he was finished. And because they believed it, they stopped paying attention. That was all the opening he needed. The yard was secured, but the shock lingered. Men moved on instinct alone, reloading, checking corners, dragging the wounded out of the open. Nobody spoke more than necessary. Words felt inappropriate, almost disrespectful to what had just happened. The moment had passed too quickly to process, yet its weight pressed down on everyone who had witnessed it. The Americans regrouped and pushed outward, sealing the village completely before nightfall. German resistance collapsed in pockets, some surrendering immediately, others firing a few desperate shots before realizing it was over. The threat from the rear never came. Whatever plans the Germans had been forming in that yard died with their hesitation. When darkness finally settled, fires burned low inside ruined houses. Weapons were stacked. Guards doubled. No one trusted assumptions anymore. The men who had knelt in the snow earlier sat quietly, hands wrapped around canteens, staring into nothing. They understood how close they had come to disappearing without a trace. Word of the incident traveled the way such stories always did, carried by exhausted soldiers in half-whispered sentences. Each retelling focused on the same detail, not the gunfire, not the bodice, the pause, the brief, fatal certainty that nothing unexpected would happen. Officers took statements later. They asked for timelines, numbers, positions. The answers were consistent but uncomfortable. The event refused to fit neatly into doctrine or training manuals. It hinged on something no checklist accounted for: the belief that a man had already stopped being dangerous. Days later, the unit moved on. New ground. New fighting. The war did not slow down to acknowledge individual moments, no matter how decisive they felt at the time. The American at the center of it all returned to his role without comment. He did not seek attention. He did not repeat the story unless required. To him, it was not a miracle or a legend. It was a refusal. In the months that followed, the war ended. Survivors went home carrying different versions of the same memory. Some remembered the noise. Some remembered the officer's face when certainty failed him. Others remembered the cold most clearly, and the sound of laughter cutting through it. Years later, people would analyze moments like this from a distance, trying to extract meaning. They would speak about courage under pressure, about initiative, about leadership. Those words were not wrong, but they missed something simpler and more unsettling. Wars are often decided by what people believe is no longer possible. In that yard, the Germans believed resistance was finished. They believed control had been achieved. That belief shaped their posture, their timing, their attention. It created the pause that changed the outcome. The American did not win because he was stronger or faster. He won because he rejected the idea that the moment was over. While everyone else treated the situation as resolved, he treated it as unfinished. That difference mattered. History remembers battles and campaigns, but it is shaped just as much by moments when assumptions collapse, when someone refuses to behave the way they are expected to, when certainty turns into confusion, and confusion into defeat. The lesson was never about violence. It was about awareness, about understanding that the instant you decide nothing can go wrong is often the instant it does. They thought he was already finished, and because of that, they stopped watching. In war, that is sometimes all it takes.